I'm Elizabeth Hand, Liz. I'm going to read from Curious Toys, which, as you can see, is my forthcoming novel by Elizabeth Hand. So, highly collectible arc. It's like that stamp with the upside-down biplane. I won't go too much into what the book is about because I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow about the artist Henry Darger, sometimes Henry Darger. I can't remember when, but sometime tomorrow, I think at 11. So I will read from this book. I have 4 short sections, and I'm just going to read till I run out of time. Some of you may have heard me read from the beginning of this before. The main thing you need to know is the protagonist, the person who is the point of view character, is a 14-year-old girl named Pin. She is passing as a boy. The setting is Chicago in 1914. She lives with her mother at Riverview Amusement Park, which is a real place. This is a book with a lot of historical characters in it, and it has an historical setting. So, this is from Curious Toys. There he was again, smoking a cigar in front of the infant incubators. A white man, not much taller than Pin, and she was small for her age and looked 12 rather than 14, but too tall to be a midget. There was something stealthy and twitchy about him. Every few minutes his head would shake violently and he'd punch the air, fending off an invisible assailant. There was no attacker. Crowded as the amusement park was, Pin saw no one anywhere near him. The young mothers dragging their kids into the infant incubators building to escape the heat stepped off the sidewalk onto the pike to avoid coming within 2 feet of him. He was a dingbat. She ran her sweaty hands across her knickerbockers, removed her cap to fan her face. She'd seen the weird little man at the park often. 3 or 4 times a week, he'd be standing near one of the rides, always watching. He never seemed to change out of the same soiled work clothes. Trousers, shirt, a dark blue canvas jacket, heavy boots, a white boater hat with a stained red band. Sometimes a bowler. Today, it was a boater. He never rode any of the rides, and he never seemed to partake in any of the attractions. Once, she'd seen him outside the casino restaurant drinking a glass of beer and eating a sausage. A few times, he'd been with another man, older, the two of them like Mutt and Jeff in the Funnies. One tall and skinny, the other short with that grubby mustache and dinged-up boater. But lately, the weird little man was always alone. And all he ever seemed to do was watch the kids go in and out of the infant incubators, hop off and on the velvet coaster, clamber on into the boats that bore them into Hellgate or the old mill rides, then back out again. He knew Pin was watching him. She could tell by the way his eyes slanted when he cocked his head, pretending to look in the other direction, the way Mr. Lerwin used to look at her younger sister, Abriana, before Abriana disappeared. But the dingbat wouldn't know that Pin was a girl disguised as a boy. No one knew, except Pin and her mother. He talked to himself, too. One of these days, she'd sidle up close enough to hear what he was saying, but not this morning. She tucked her cap back down, felt in her pocket for the Helmar cigarette box Max had given her half an hour ago, along with a cuff to the back of her head. "Don't you go dragging your feet like last time," it said. "I can't afford to lose business." "It was raining. Lionel ain't gonna ditch you." "It's not raining today. Go!" He raised his hand in warning. She darted out of the dressing room and heard him laughing behind her. "Run, Rabbit, run!" She spat on the pavement, kicking at a squash stogie, spun on her heel and headed for the exit gate. When she glanced back over her shoulder, the dingbatty little man was gone. The only other thing I should have told you was that her younger sister, Abriana, disappeared 2 years ago and is presumed dead, abducted, and killed. Pin hadn't always lived at the amusement park. Only since her mother, Gina, started working there as a fortune teller. Pin had been born when her mother was the same age as Pin was now, her sister, Abriana, 2 years later. Back then, they lived in a tenement in Little Hell, the Sicilian slum on Chicago's north side. Over the years, Gina had told Pin that her father was dead, had moved back to Italy, was mining gold in South America, or had run off with the woman who owned the Chinese laundry in Larrabee Street. Until one day when Pin asked about him, Gina slapped her so hard her left ear rang for an entire day. She never brought it up again. Little Hell was overshadowed by a huge gas house which belched flames and fumes that blotted out the sun. Day and night, red neckerchiefed men shoveled tons of coal into the furnace, then doused the glowing coals with water from the river. The resulting gas was stored in huge tanks, their cylinders rising through the day, then dropping overnight, as the gas was piped into the surrounding tenements for lights and heat and cooking. As a very young girl, Pin had mistaken the furnace's deafening thunder for that of approaching trains. The women from the Relief and Aid Society complained constantly about how their white uniforms turned black as they approached Little Hell. But they never drew near to Death Corner, where the black hand gangs that ruled Little Hell dumped the bodies of their victims beneath a dead tree twisted as a corkscrew. Pin had stopped counting the number of murders when it reached 100. They left Little Hell in May, when Gina started working as a gypsy fortune teller at Riverview. She also worked at the park's vast ballroom, teaching customers the latest dance craze: foxtrot, turkey trot, grizzly bear hug, bunny hug. Before that, she'd sewed ribbons onto women's hats for a milliner in State Street. But hat sales had dropped after Christmas and never picked up again, and the shop closed in April. There was no money for the rent. For a week, they'd eaten nothing but coarse wheat flour boiled in water. The night before they fled their tenement, Gina had locked the door to the room. Pin didn't know why she bothered. They had nothing to steal. Putting a finger to her lips, Gina dropped to her knees in front of the sofa and dragged out a burlap sack Pin had never seen before. Her mother rummaged through it, pulling out a pair of knickerbockers and a white cambric shirt. "Get undressed and try these on. Miss Pulvia gave them to me after her son ran off to Montana." Pin stared at her, dumbfounded, until Gina threw the clothes in her face. Pin grabbed them, tore off her pinafore and chemise, and kicked them across the floor. She pulled on the knickerbockers and shirt, fingers shaking so she almost couldn't button them. There was no mirror in the room, but her mother's expression told her what she needed to know. "Am I?" Gina nodded. Pin bit her lip so she wouldn't cry. For as long as she could recall, this was all she'd wanted. When she remembered her dreams, she recalled being neither girl nor boy, only flying, nothing between her skin and the wind. She hated waking up, even more so in the last 6 months since she first menstruated, and her mother had explained, or tried to, what the blood on her drawers portended: childbirth, babies, the end of freedom, the end of everything. Being a girl was like a huge scab she couldn't scrape off, no matter how hard she tried. As she stood there in her new clothes, her mother produced the shears she used to trim ostrich willows. She grasped a handful of Pin's unruly curls and began to cut. At last, the snicking of the shears stopped. Pin ran a hand across her cropped head, then took a few deep breaths so she could feel the air moving inside this strange new creature, herself. Her mother handed her an elastic truss designed for a small man. "Your titties are so small you hardly need this, but wear it anyway. You have to stay safe. We're not going to use our real names. I don't want anyone knowing who we are." "Why?" Gina slapped her, hard enough that Pin's eyes sparked. "You know why. If anyone asks, your name is Mufuchi, not Onofria, Mafuchi." Pin turned to her mother, so her mother wouldn't see her tears. "What about your name?" "Mafuchi, the same as yours. Of course it would be the same. I'm still your mother." She pulled Pin close and embraced her for a heartbeat. Gina's breath scented with sen-sen and schnapps, and then quickly pushed her away. "In the fall it will all be different. Till then, you need to stay safe." Safe. Pin bit her lip to keep from arguing with her. No one was ever safe. So Pin is a drug runner, and she runs, reefer, marijuana, and heroin and drugs to people around town. And so she's on a drug run, and she's bringing it to S&A Studio, which was the real film studio, the silent film studio, which was in Chicago at the time. They were all silent films. It was just a movie studio. This is the studio where Charlie Chaplin filmed The Tramp, where a lot of very famous silent films were shot. So S&A Studio took up a whole city block, its name carved above the entrance with its distinctive logo. The profile of an Indian chief wearing an eagle headdress. Outside, the building looked like a factory. Inside, the heavy air smelled of drugstore perfume and cigarette smoke, cleaning fluid, grease paint, and a peculiar sweet odor that came from the long spools of motion picture film. Sometimes she heard hysterical laughter or sobs in here, or a dog barking. Once, a man had raced past her, stark naked except for a towel clutched to his privates. Another time, she ducked into a closet as a dozen policemen strode down the hall, only to realize they were in costume. She halted when she reached a row of doors. She pushed open the one that bore a sign with the names Glory and Valerie on it, revealing two girls in shimmies. They stood side by side, perusing a clothing rack. "Hi, Glory." Glory, the smaller of the two, turned to greet her, bearing big white teeth and a smile. "Hiya, Pin. Come on in," she said absently, and continued her inspection of the costumes. She wore a silk teddy bear, a sleeveless chemise that clung to her breasts and barely grazed the tops of her thighs. Like Pin, she was slight, just under 5 feet tall, deeply tanned with an olive tinge to her smooth skin, thick black hair, and striking sapphire blue eyes. She had a mole on her chin that she concealed with powder when she had to go in front of the camera, and smelled of cardamom and sugar and toasted almonds. Her Aunt Inga often sent her to work with pastries to share. Lionel, who's the person she's bringing the drugs to, Lionel jokingly referred to her as Princess Glorious, or the Spanish princess, and Pin almost believed it. Small as she was, Glory could command a room. She wanted to be an opera singer, not an actress, but the studio paid her well. $13 for a week's work as an extra, whether they used her or not, with Sundays off. Only 16, Glory looked older, especially when she tilted her head and regarded Pin through narrowed eyes. She regularly got cast as an imperious matron or head waitress. Now she held up a faded blue satin gown with half-moon stains beneath the sleeves. "What do you think, Pin? Suit me as a banker's wife?" "Sure." Pin took off her cap and fanned herself. The tiny room was hot enough to melt wax. "That color is nice with your eyes." The other girl, Valerie, grimaced. "God, it's ugly. You have such nice things, Glory. Why would you even want to wear it? It makes you look 30. I'm supposed to look 30. Gloria reached for a pincushion and gave Pin a sidewise glance. "You looking for Lionel? He's down in the studio. Here, hold this for me." Glory shoved the mass of blue satin into her arms. Pin wrinkled her nose. You'd think the fancy clothes they wore in the movies would smell of perfume and eau de cologne. Instead, they reeked of tobacco smoke and perspiration, and sometimes of scorched hair if whoever had been wearing them had stood too close to a spotlight. "I'm heading out." Valerie pulled a mohair bathing suit over her chemise and plucked a smoldering cigarette from an ashtray. "They want pictures for that Sweetie movie they did at the lake. Newspaper advertisement. See you later, Glorious. Bye, Pin." Valerie swanned from the cubicle. When she was gone, Glory rolled her eyes. "She is not going to get her picture taken. Guess who's here?" "Who?" "Charlie Chaplin. Spoor's trying to sweet-talk him back to the studio. They're all down there on the stage. Lionel's with them, even though he can't stand Charlie. Probably the only reason Lionel even came in today is that he's waiting for you. Don't you ever worry about bringing that reefer here or anywhere?" Pin flushed and Glory laughed, reaching to stroke her neck. "Oh, you're hot." Pin forced a grin. She lived in terror that one of the Riverview boys would figure out her secret. Far worse if Glory did, with her white teeth and rouged mouth and all that soft black hair. But Glory's attention had already returned to the satin dress. She held it in front of her. "Too long?" Pin could clearly see Glory's nipples through the pink charmeuse of her teddy. "No," she stammered. "It looks just right." "Okay, thanks." Glory stepped into the dress. Pin hoped she'd asked her to button it, blushing again when she realized the buttons ran down the front. I better go," she said at last. "Bye," replied Glory without looking up. So, and now this is Pin's first meeting with Henry Darger, who the two of them separately have witnessed what they believe is an abduction of a young girl. A man and a young girl went into the Hellgate, the dark ride, and only the man in the boat came out. And Henry has signaled to her to come and see him, and she recognizes him as the dingbat. So she goes over to meet him. He looked like Charlie Chaplin. Not the handsome actor she'd glimpsed at S&A, but the tramp, the weird little fellow Chaplin played in the movies. Though this man wore a boater, not a bowler. And apart from his straw hat, his clothes were all blue. A grimy bow tie, indigo pants, everything well worn. He'd wrapped twine around one battered shoe, tying it in a filthy knot. He had very pale, round blue eyes, bug eyes, and ruddy skin. His ears stuck out. He was even shorter than she'd first thought, not much over 5 feet, barely taller than she was. Everybody at this time was short. All of these historical people, they were all short. Really. A lot of people were barely 5 feet tall. She could knock him down easy. She waited for him to speak. He looked away uneasily, his gaze sliding sideways. She continued to stare at him, but still he wouldn't meet her eyes. Annoyed, she finally demanded, "What do you want?" "She's gone." He still wouldn't look at her. "Who?" He moved his hand, drawing a strange pattern in the air, and Pin felt her neck prickle. "You mean the girl?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the Hellgate Pavilion. Pin expected him to go on, but he said nothing. Maybe he wasn't just dingbatty, but a moron. Perhaps he'd been the man who'd taken the girl into Hellgate. She stared at his hands, which were big, the skin chapped raw, his fingernails broken and dirty. He smelled strongly of sweat and Bellamy soap. She tried to determine if there were any bloodstains on his cuffs, but the blue fabric was too dark. It could be him. She took a deep breath. At Hellgate, there was a girl. I saw a girl going with someone. A man, she added, watching to see how he reacted. And yes, one of his eyelids fluttered. He blinked rapidly before nodding. "I saw her too." He grunted like he was imitating a frog. He was much younger than she'd first thought, not more than 22 or 23. The scruffy mustache was to make him appear older, but close up it had the opposite effect. He seemed unaware of how odd he appeared, flapping his hand in the air and making those weird noises. Was he a jack roller? She glanced down to see if he had a blackjack in his pocket. He lifted his head and for the first time met her gaze. "I've been watching you," he said. She edged backwards as he slid his hand into a pocket, but instead of a knife or blackjack, he withdrew a handmade cardboard wallet bound with more twine. He opened it with great care and sorted through a wad of news clippings, cigarette cards, scraps of dirty paper. At last he pulled out a small card and handed it to her. And this is what it says. "Gemini Child Protective Agency, Black Brothers Lodge, Enrico Dargero, President." She read it, puzzled. "Gemini? Are you with the freak show?" "No!" The man shouted so loudly that she jumped. "Are you an idiot?" He tried to snatch the card back, but she yanked her hand away. "Enrico Dargero? That's you?" "It is." Hearing his name seemed to calm him. He nodded solemnly. "I'm from Brazil." "Brazil?" She shot him a doubtful look. The words on the card looked like they'd been first written in pencil and then traced in black ink. "You a detective?" He nodded. "We keep them safe. Girls. Curls. Because." "We?" "Me and Willie, silly." "Who's Willie?" "My friend, the night watchman. He's gone to Decatur. Later." She recalled the tall man she often saw him with, the other half of Mutt and Jeff. She glanced at the card again. Gemini Child Protective Society. "Is your name really Enrico?" He scowled and murmured something she could barely hear. It sounded like Henry. "Who are you?" he demanded, as though it had been her idea to meet and not his. She hesitated. "Pin?" "Pin?" Henry laughed in disbelief. His deep voice grew shrill as a woman's. "Pinprick, pinhead, pinhole, just Pin. So you and this night watchman, you're the Gemini, and you find them, missing kids?" Yes. Did you see where he took her? She shook her head. Are you sure? She shrugged. I guess. I looked around afterwards, but I didn't see her anywhere, or him. Did you? No. He seemed disappointed, like he regretted having signaled her to join him. I need to go. He gestured at the card. Reluctantly, she returned it, and he slid it back into the cardboard wallet. He didn't notice as a scrap of newspaper fell to the ground. Do you ever find them? She asked. The missing children. My sister? Henry raised a finger to his lips, turned, and broke into a shambling run, his head jerking back and forth as though arguing with someone. So I'm going to skip the rest of that and skip ahead a little bit. She finds one of the things that falls out of his wallet is a newspaper clipping about an 11-year-old girl who'd gone missing a year or so before. So she's suspicious of it. With good reason. So this is later on when Henry has talked her into accompanying him to the Black Brothers Lodge, which he thinks is going to be an exciting place where the Gemini meet. The Black Brothers Lodge turned out to be a weathered barn behind a sprawling white house on Roscoe Street. A nice part of town, not the sort of area where she'd expect to find a secret society holed up. This is it? Pin gave Henry a doubtful look as they hurried down the sidewalk. He'd had to pay her streetcar fare. She was flat broke. Yes, he said. He kept glancing stealthily over his shoulder in a way guaranteed to draw attention if anyone happened to notice a very short, scruffy-looking man and an even scruffier boy walking in a respectable neighborhood early on a Sunday evening. We need to get inside before anyone sees us. Pin wondered if they were doing something illegal. She began to look around nervously as well. On the streetcar, Henry had stared at her with such a strange, intense expression, she began to feel frightened. What if Henry was a fairy? She'd contemplated hopping off the streetcar and running back to Riverview, but next thing she knew, he was gesturing at their stop. There were no street lamps here, only large old trees and green lawns in front of houses, all but hidden behind rhododendrons and azaleas and hydrangea bushes. Lights glimmered in some of the houses, but not at their destination. Is anyone home? She wondered. I told you he's gone to Decatur! Traitor! This is Willie's house? She looked at him in surprise. Do you live here too? Henry shook his head. I told you I live by the hospital. But before that, was this your house? Before that, I lived in the asylum. The asylum? Till I was 17. How old are you now? 23. They kept me there when I was 12. I only escaped 6 years ago. They called it Crazy House. Were you... She almost asked if he was crazy. Why did you live there? I burned a building, many buildings. A peddler cheated me and I snuck into his yard and set his crates afire. It burned to the ground, an entire building. I was a very dangerous boy. I burned up a picture of Jesus Christ. I hit a boy on the head with a brick and blood came out of his ear. Once, I pushed a baby down the stairs. I killed a man too, but nobody knew about that. And I threw hot ashes on a little girl. She went into the hospital. My father had to pay for it. Pin stared at him, repulsed yet also fascinated. Why'd you do all that? I just hated babies! He shook his head in remorse. Not now. Now I love and protect them. My little sister disappeared when I was 4. Pin's neck went cold. Your sister? What happened? Nobody told me. What about your father? Father, bother! Henry cut across the lawn toward the house. He made good pancakes. I cut and teach her with a knife, her arms and face. What a place! They put me in the house for boys. Awful noise. People did bad things. I watched the snow. He threw an invisible snowball. Blizzards! People froze standing up. I saw a cyclone pick up a barn with cows in it. There were cows hanging on the trees. You had to climb to get milk. That's not true. Who said it was? Where was your mother? Dead in bed. My sister murdered her. I went to an outside school until Dr. Stegman sent me to the asylum. A big tunnel where we walked in the winter under the snow. That was where the people froze to death, in the fields by the asylum. They turned to icicles. Men put them in their mouth and sucked on them. 7 years I kept running away. Finally, I escaped. Pin rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the chill that had overcome her at the words, "My little sister disappeared when I was 4." In the near dark, Henry looked younger and tougher than he had back at Riverview. 23 wasn't so old, really. She would have felt safer with someone older. She'd looked up at the dark house and trees in front of them. She would have felt safer if she hadn't come at all.